You are listening to the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast, where you discover management insights and strategies for a successful dental practice. There are also interviews with key people in the industry who have advice and services to help you and your team achieve great success. Welcome to this week's episode of the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast. And we are joined again today by Meghan Warren, Principal and Director of Burke Associates Law Firm. They are our resident go-to law firm for guidance in the legal areas that do impact dental practices. And I am thrilled to be able to talk about the complexities and the legalities around and the things to consider around buying a dental practice. Thank you so much for joining us again, Meghan.
Thanks for having me, Julie.
It's my pleasure to have your firm involved. It's such a wonderful source of information for people. And with the clients that you manage in terms of buying a dental practice, at what point should a prospective buyer actually get their legal firm involved?
Oh, that's a good question. I always like to say as early as possible, even if it's just for a 45-minute, hour Zoom or in-person meeting when we can do in-person meetings, to talk about what the plans are, so what the goals are, what type of practice they might be looking to buy, perhaps what experience they've had in ownership of a practice or any sort of business previously. Things like getting the structuring right around what structure to purchase the entity in. It's really good to do early on. And of course, important tips that we can give around, liaising with the vendor, negotiating terms with the vendor, due diligence in the early stages, things like that. You're always geared better for those conversations and things if you have that initial chat with a lawyer first.
And I remember back when I bought my dental practice in 2003. And when you're young and you've got the dreams of owning a business in your eyes and in your vision, you do tend to just look at the great things without looking at the drawbacks of any particular scenario. And you do tend to have faith in the person that's promising you and making you all these assurances in terms of the seller making these assurances to you without being fully aware of the pitfalls that could possibly come up. And I imagine the legal side of that really does help bring that balanced overview, observation to the process.
Yeah, 100%. It's very much and it's a wonderful thing to be really excited about being involved in your first business, buying your first practice and things. But yeah, you're right that tends to sort of overtake the view in terms of, you only see the positive, similar to when you're, buying your first house and things like that. We really try to be, lawyers are we're trained to point out the risks and things like that, but we try not to take a negative approach or to dampen that spirit in terms of the excitement. It's more just an education piece really about, these are the things to look out for. We'll usually provide a helpful checklist and some tips and things, at that initial meeting or shortly afterwards, just so that the client has a little more background, a little more information and knows the right questions to ask really, because it might be the difference between a client choosing a practice that potentially is not the right one. No deal is better tthan a bad deal sometimes in that circumstance, and it might be the difference between two different practices that a client's looking at. So
yeah, that's a good phrase, that no deal is often better than a bad deal. And have you seen instances in the past, have people come to you after the deal's already been done saying, crikey, this is kind of the situation that I've put myself into?
All the time. All the time. Which is, and that's okay. That's okay. We will usually try and although we can't sort of turn back the wheels of time, we try to do what we can to help and fix things where perhaps there's, for example, a heads of agreement which might have been signed between the vendor and purchaser, where the purchaser hasn't had any advice or anything prior to signing the heads of agreement. And even though the heads of agreement, they're usually non-binding, but, I say that with a grain of salt because it just depends on how they're drafted. Essentially you are really holding yourself to certain positions in that heads of agreement. It would be very difficult to try to move away from, say, key terms that are recorded in the heads of agreement when you're trying to negotiate the sale of business contract later on. So, and there can be issues too with the heads of agreement, whether it is or isn't legally binding. Sometimes the document will say one thing but actually mean another and things like that, which can be difficult to navigate afterwards. So I always say that even though it might be a very short document, it might be only a couple of pages, and yes, the intention might be that it's not legally binding, we always recommend that our clients at least have a lawyer look over it before they sign it. So because it's hard to undo things that are recorded.
And I think that's it, isn't it? It's hard to undo. And certainly if you've entered into a sale contract and you've signed down the bottom of that and just say it's been a contract that's been solely generated by the seller's lawyers and you haven't had a law firm look over it on your behalf, you have to live with those conditions for a long time.
That's right. And it's, you don't know what you don't know too in that circumstance. So if the vendor's solicitor has prepared the heads of agreement, prepared the contract, and you haven't had any advice at all on that, it's highly likely that it will not be in your favour in a number of respects, because it's it's been drafted by the other side for the other side's interests, really. And that's right, there might be ongoing conditions in that agreement too, and obviously you're the one that's owning the practice, so essentially you've purchased it on that basis. So
what's been your experience for people who are about to buy their very first dental practice? What's been your experience of the length of time? I know it's about how long is a piece of string, but are we talking weeks or months when we go from, I think I found a practice that I like, to I'm sitting in it and working away?
Yeah. So I guess it varies with the parties really, depending on what the goals are on both sides. But generally from that sort of first period where you spot a practice that you want and, start to conduct a bit of due diligence to the point of actually settling. So you'd probably have whether you have a heads of agreement in there, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, or you just might go straight to a contract for the sale of business and then settlement. You're probably looking at, I would say, around 2 months is a pretty reasonable time. I mean, many clients come to us and say, look, I found this, I just want it to happen, I want settlement to happen next week and that sort of thing. And usually this always occurs around the end of a financial year as well, that it's 30 June or 1st of July, it's got to happen by then. And look, we can do that, we can always push things through, but I usually caution against that because things might get skipped over, like there might be a lesser period of due diligence, or sometimes clients just say, look, I don't need any due diligence. Perhaps they've worked in the practice previously and they sort of say, look, no, I'm happy, I know how things work. But even though they know how things work as a non-owner, they don't know much about the actual business and how it works. So we always try and sort of interrogate, what's the urgency? So why is there this press for time? Because sometimes the reasons for the press for time might not be as important as doing a proper job, essentially.
And it might be a personality thing. I'm Petrus, and I want things done straight away. We all need that other person to pull us back and go, hang on a second, let's, as you say, let's do the due diligence, because this is going to be a long term that we're living with these conditions that we're signing off on.
That's right.
Before we go further down that process, I was just wondering, do you have any stories in the past? I know it sounds terrible, but they're kind of difficult experiences that buyers of practices have gone down the path of, and what lessons other people could learn from those stories.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try and do this in a way that doesn't identify anybody or anything like that. So this is probably on that point that I've raised just previously around pushing for time, and where our client, a purchaser, just by their nature, it's, very, very, wants things done straight away, and sort of found a practice, had their heart set on this practice. This is had all of the negotiations themselves leading up to signing a heads of agreement, didn't get any legal advice or anything until it was sort of the point of, okay, we need a formal contract prepared or reviewed. So at that point, we were engaged to review the contract prepared by the other side, and as part of that, you do conduct some form of due diligence on the business and try to point things, even though we haven't gone into the business and reviewed things, haven't been involved in the early stages. You do still ask questions and make sure, look, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And all of these things started to sort of come out in terms of issues with the practice, which hadn't been looked at properly because our client was so keen to just push ahead and had in their mind that it was a good practice to buy, and that was based mostly on representations that the vendor had made to our client directly, and they seemed to get along well, and our client just trusted that those representations were true. So we started to point a few things out. Look, the compliance around the practice doesn't look like it's been done properly. There are real concerns with, no contracts being put in place. There were issues with some third-party contracts as well. And ultimately, it got to a position where the relationship between the vendor and the purchaser, when questions started to be asked about these things, it started to unravel, and our client essentially said, oh, look, I actually don't want to buy this one anymore. I sort of want to get out, which we were able to do. We were able to negotiate an outcome for the client so that was all, there was no issues, I guess, in terms of extracting from the process. But it does, there are things like wasted time, like wasted legal costs, like the stress of sort of going through that process, which if the client had have engaged a lawyer early on and sort of taken some advice about the form of the heads of agreement, what should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, and importantly, conducted a bit more due diligence on the practice prior to even entering into a heads of agreement, then it wouldn't have got to the position that it did. So, that's quite a common scenario, and it can become worse if a contract is signed and then the purchaser makes the decision later on, very close to settlement, or, I want to pull out, and there's no sort of mechanism for that in the contract. So in this circumstance, luckily, we were able to find one, but it can turn ugly in terms of litigation and things if a client doesn't want to settle based on a contract they've signed and there's no real proper basis to get out.
It does seem like, think of the really big things we do in life. Marriage is a big deal. It goes on for a long time, hopefully, and it's very painful and traumatic if it was going to end and you've got to start separating possessions and all the rest of it. Another big one is going to be buying a business, and it really does seem like the higher the level of risk for you personally and financially and all the other things. And with a business, you've got, just like with a marriage, you've got children who rely on you managing it well. In a business, you've got team members that are relying upon you as well. And so the amount of risk is very, very high. And so the higher the risk, the higher the due diligence. And it is around exposing yourself to the information that you just don't have. And that's where lawyers have all of that information.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And it's, sometimes clients can get concerned about things that lawyers recommend, like, getting us involved in due diligence early on and sort of spending money on these things initially. But there is real value and real reason for recommending those things, and it's only because we can see when it goes wrong that we do recommend it. It's certainly not a situation where we're recommending it, every time. Some practices we may be looking at, and the client's already got, a fair amount of information about the practice, potentially has been working in the practice We may provide them with a checklist for other things to ask themselves directly of the vendor, and they may get a lot of information, and it's really, any due diligence is quite small on our side. Perhaps the vendor is quite open and transparent about letting the purchaser, view the practice and providing information, and those are always really good signs too. But it's more those other situations where there's really, really limited information that's been provided. Perhaps the vendor's a little slow, or sort of says, oh no, we don't have those in place, we don't have that sort of information. Those are sort of red flags, that we would usually recommend, okay, well, we think some more due diligence would need to happen before any contracts are signed. But you're right, it is a huge risk, and it's especially purchasing a dental practice where there are, there's staff, there's sort of an existing culture, there's an existing way that the business has been run, that a purchaser really needs to get their head around and really needs to be comfortable with, because coming in and essentially trying to, I suppose, not respecting that history and sort of the way things have been done and trying to do things completely different from day one usually won't work. So the purchaser's really got to be comfortable with, okay, how am I going to sort of transition this new ownership, and does the practice kind of sit with my vision for the business, and could it transition to my vision, quite easily, or over a number of years? Like, there needs to be a bit of sort of thought and forward planning in that way, and disclosure about these things too by the vendor.
Very good. So let's talk about a few of the things. If it was a brand new practice, well, not a brand new practice, but if it was a dentist going into a practice that had been advertised for sale, they walk in the front door, shake the owner's hand. What should be their next step? I remember back, I was so ridiculously ignorant when I was buying my practice, and I didn't know what to look for. So I started just going around to practices that were for sale, just so I could get an experience of going in there and getting a feel of what I was supposed to be looking at. But what is your advice moving forward from that very first meeting?
Yeah. So I guess in that circumstance where, if you're a purchaser and you know that a practice is up for sale, look, sometimes there'll be a broker involved, like a business broker involved, not all the time, but sometimes. So there'll be a process that the business broker will require the purchaser to go through. So getting in contact with the broker, and usually the broker will have perhaps an information memorandum or some other preliminary documents about the practice that you should ask for, and that's the start of the due diligence process, really. Making a time, if there's a business broker involved, making a time with them to go and view the practice, and always having that initial meeting, I think, with the vendor is really important to, if the vendor's willing, which often they will be, to just sit down with them one-on-one and really ask the questions that you want to know about the business and how it's run, its history, why they're wanting to sell, those sorts of things. We've got a pretty helpful sort of checklist of things that purchasers should sort of ask at the initial meeting, because from that initial meeting you may very easily be able to make a decision, I want to progress further, or no, it's not for me, for doing too much further work. If it is following that meeting, the potential purchaser decides, this is one of the ones I want more information about, the business broker will usually have a process around requesting further information, more detailed information about the practice. But it's really at that point that I would say reach out to a lawyer and discuss, look, this is the information I've been given about the practice already. I'm quite keen to progress things further. Perhaps usually the business broker might have a form of heads of agreement at that point that they want signed, or an expression of interest or something like that. So providing the lawyer with a copy of that document, and lawyer can then sit down with the client and sort of go through, look, do we want to make some sort of formal offer at this point, non-binding sort of heads of agreement, or do we need more information about the practice before we do that? So really going through what are the best options based on the circumstances of that practice at the time.
And that heads of agreement, is that a document that kind of holds that seller responsible to not turn around and sell it to somebody else without making sure that a discussion is had with the original potential buyer?
Yeah. So that's an important point, one of the important points to cover off at that stage. So will any expression of interest or heads of agreement that's signed be sort of for an exclusive period? Often that's the case, particularly if the vendor's asking for some form of deposit or something to be paid on the signing of the heads of agreement. You'd really want an exclusive period where you could be dealing with the vendor and the vendor won't go and deal with other purchasers. Perhaps a period of, say, 21 days where further due diligence can be conducted, and the parties can negotiate sort of terms of a contract of sale. Longer if necessary, but as a purchaser, you'd want some sort of certainty that, look, I'm not spending all this time and money on a process where the vendor might get a better offer tomorrow, and then, I've sort of wasted my time and money in that way. So as a purchaser, some form of exclusivity would be recommended, at that stage.
Nice. And, we do see various practices come up for sale, and as we were mentioning before, sometimes the dream to own your own business becomes the most important goal rather than I want to make the best purchase possible being the ultimate goal. And I get notifications of practices that are for sale from Dentist Job Search. And every now and again you do see these practices. They've only been functioning for a couple of years. They can't have really built up too much of a goodwill, and the turnover is really quite low. And I think to go through a legal firm is also an additional benefit is they've seen all the very many different types of practices out there, and they've seen the ones that have been successful and the ones that are just a battle to get off the ground properly under the new ownership.
Yeah, 100%. And that's especially one of the benefits of using lawyers who usually work with clients in the dental industry and medical and health industries as well. Is you get really good at seeing different, sometimes the same issues, red flags, concerns that you might have, practices that are doing really well or likely to do really well, and then those that perhaps are not. And that's that due diligence process as well. So getting a lawyer involved on the legal due diligence side, and then a good accountant as well who's also got experience in working with dental practices to look at the financial due diligence side of things. So things like the trading, the financials for the last sort of 3 years at least, and things like cash flow of the business, how has that been, things like a value to be put on the practice, whether the accountant can give some view of that or whether there needs to be a more formal sort of valuation process, which can sort of add to the cost. So if you are able to have an accountant who's got some experience in working with value of businesses as well, that's usually the best way to try and formulate a informed view on what's a good purchase price here. What's something that's fair and real in terms of the value of the practice and the future value of the practice too.
Yeah, and I wonder if have you experienced that with the COVID situation being longer than any of us thought it was going to have an impact on all of our lives? And I know I'm in Melbourne, you're in Melbourne as well, but for other states around Australia as well, I know that you work with people all over the place. Have you noticed that the COVID impact has made any impact on the number of practices for sale, or the number of people, I should say, buying practices and sale price? Is it having an impact from what you've seen?
Yeah, I would definitely say that there are more practices for sale than, and particularly over probably the start of this year, I would say, and coming through, a lot of people, I think, came back from the sort of December, January holidays and sort of went, look, this is just too hard in terms of running a business running a dental practice moving forward, or perhaps they're sort of, bringing forward their retirement a year or two more than they otherwise would have. There's a fair amount of that we've seen. In terms of people purchasing dental practices, I mean, there still seems to be plenty of buyers out there, but it's more this due diligence side of things becomes even more important. You now have to consider, well, what's the ongoing sort of viability and the value in this practice, where we're likely to be subject to a fair amount of ongoing, government sort of shutdowns, or needing to justify whether treatment is essential or critical, and that sort of thing. It's definitely the dental industry has really been hit by COVID and ability to operate those sorts of businesses. So who knows? Hopefully we'll see that lesson next year with more people getting vaccinated, and hopefully that means less restrictions and things. But this year's been hard. It's been really tough on the dental industry too. So
yeah. And we were just chatting earlier about the mandated vaccines coming through now as well. That again will have a knock-on effect around the viability of a practice, because all of a sudden staffing may become an issue. Staffing has already been an issue in the dental industry, and I think even more people will be leaving it. And so then that becomes another risk to try to mitigate as much as you can.
Yes.
You were talking about the red flags before. There was a client of mine a few years ago that wanted to buy a particular practice, and the seller said, I don't want to tell my staff until the last minute, so I don't want you to meet them. I don't want that to me, that was a red flag. What are your thoughts around that red flag and other ones that may come up?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because the purchaser always wants to come in and meet the staff and meet the dentist and see the practice, very early on. But from the vendor's perspective, you can understand too that the purchaser might decide not to proceed, and then they've come in and met the staff, and it sort of has could potentially have an adverse effect on their business. Or they may not have told, their staff at all, and they as you say, they don't want to tell them till the last minute because they're concerned that they might leave or that sort of thing. So it's tricky to manage, and we have advice for our clients, on both sides, whether they're purchasers or whether they're vendors in this scenario. But I think there does, from a purchaser's perspective, there does need to be, or you should be pushing for some opportunity to definitely go in and see the practice, as it's working day to day, to meet some of the key dentists that are there, and to meet some, the practice manager, not necessarily all the staff, but just some of the more senior staff. So practice manager, and perhaps some, if there's some dental hygienists that are senior sort of there, and that sort of thing. But it's about the timing of that. So it would be unlikely that the vendor would be allowing that opportunity for sort of every potential purchaser. But once you got to the point of, say, signing a heads of agreement, and you're then working with the vendor to agree terms of a formal contract of sale, during that period it would be reasonable for the purchaser to come in and to meet those staff, and for the vendor to really have some sort of messaging to the business, because essentially, short of something really, I suppose, negative coming up in the due diligence period, or a failure for the parties to agree on really key terms, it's highly likely that the sale will go through. Once a heads of agreement signed, deposit has been paid, and there's an initial period of due diligence that's been satisfied. At that point, I'd be saying, if the vendor was still resisting on having you come in, that it would be concerning as to why. Yeah.
Are there any other red flags that are in your head at the moment that you could mention?
Yeah, there's a number of them. I mean, on the last podcast that we did, Julie, we talked about the employee deeming issues in terms of practitioner dentists. So really digging into how dentists have been engaged by the practice in the past, and currently what's the current sort of form of agreement that they use. Is there any risk there? Because there could be ongoing risk to the business even though the ownership changes hands, unless it's dealt with properly in the contract, sometimes with indemnities and things like that. If there is a risk that it hasn't been done properly by the business in the past, the business could be audited in the future by the ATO or the SRO in terms of unpaid payroll tax, even if it's for a period prior to the purchaser owning the business. So that is important to dig into in terms of has it been done correctly, and if it hasn't, is it critical? Is it sort of a fundamental issue, or can we deal with that in terms of indemnities in the contract and that sort of thing?
And so in a worst case scenario where things just weren't managed very well at all or documented very well at all, I could go in and buy a dental practice. It's had team members there for at least a decade each. There's been 4 of them. They've all been employed as contractors where they were dealt with as employees, and then I would be solely responsible for the back pay for that whole decade, even though I've just owned the practice for a year.
Yeah, worst case scenario, that can happen, because when the ATO and the SRO look at things like unpaid payroll tax or unpaid superannuation, that sort of thing, they'll be looking at the business, they'll be looking at the practice, and it really will then be the practice facing an audit, and the practice will then have to be saying to State Revenue Office, well, we didn't own the business at that time, and the State Revenue Office will be saying, well, that'll be a matter between you and the vendor to go and sort of fight that out between yourselves. The business, as it's been operated, it hasn't been doing things correctly, essentially. So worst case scenario, that's a real risk.
And on that top, before we go into other red flags, the employment of the dental assistants, the receptionist, the practice manager, that from an employee protection perspective from Fair Work, their employment continues on. And so you really need to get an assessment of any entitlements that people have accrued to date and get that amount of money contributed by the seller of the practice.
Exactly. So that's part of some of the adjustment sort of exercise that we would do at settlement to the purchase price. So looking at, who are the employees of the practice that we want to keep, that we want to have stay on with us in the business, what sort of accrued entitlements do they have, like long service leave. Sometimes you'll have a practice manager who's been there for 20 years and never taken any leave, and will have, significant annual leave and long service leave balances. So it's really important to be super clear about in the contract about how those things are to be adjusted and sort of what proportion to be adjusted. Is it 100%? Is it 70%, 50%? And also making sure that there's an understanding there that whether or not service, continuing service would be recognised by the new practice owner for some of these employees, because that will affect things like entitlements as well. So there's a little bit of devil in that detail around the different entitlements, and it's really important to make sure that that's clear, because it can be a significant, sometimes I've had practices where entitlements have been worth, if it's a larger practice, a couple of $100,000, which could be an adjustment, various adjustments one way or the other in terms of purchase price. So it's real, it is real money that needs to be, and it can all be negotiated too.
What are some other red flags?
Other red flags, I would say with dental practices, one of the biggest issues is really the patient relationships and things. So particularly in practices where it might be maybe one or two sole practitioner or one or two sort of key dentists, where majority of the goodwill, if you like, is sort of resting in really long-term patient relationships, or not just individual patients, but like sort of families and things who have gone to this practice for a really long time. So what's what's the proposal? And this is one of these questions to sort of ask the vendor in those initial meetings is, what is that client base? What is that patient base? And how easily or not the vendors think those patient relationships could be converted to other practitioners, and sort of what is the proposal for converting those relationships to, and making sure that you're then building this into the contract, because what you don't want is a situation where, and I've seen this happen a fair bit with dental practices, where there's potentially this one, the one dentist where it's a lot of the goodwill is in this one dentist, but he or she wants to retire, as soon as the purchaser comes in and purchases the business. And it's sometimes they want, significant amount of money too to be paid up front for the practice, but then they're not sticking around. So it's sort of, well, if our client's going to pay $700,000, $800,000 for this practice, and then you're going to retire sort of the very next day, how's that going to work? How does that tie in with the value? I would be saying to clients in that scenario that likely wouldn't work, and you wouldn't be seeing the value of that upfront investment that you're making. You'd want to build in things like, say, an earn-out type provision. So it might be that you're paying an initial amount towards a purchase price, and then the vendor dental practitioner stays on for 6 months, a year, whatever it is, and is required to convert those relationships to other dental practitioners. And if the revenue is maintained at the same level, they'll receive their second payment towards a purchase price after that time. Things like that. So those sorts of discussions, in our experience, need to happen pretty early with the vendor, because otherwise the expectations around that will be sort of completely different. It's very hard to sort of try and negotiate terms like that after there's been, talk of a large purchase price being paid up front with no conditions. It's very hard to then move the vendor away from that. So again, this is sort of one of the reasons why it's important to get a lawyer involved early for the purpose of those negotiations.
I think you've raised a really crucial area there. When you've got a certain turnover of a practice, the dentist themselves has got the strongest relationship with all the patients. They've been there for decades quite often, and they are at the top of their game. They know how to be productive and efficient and convert clients into treatments and all the other things. And a newer dentist coming in, unless they've been a dentist themselves for decades, possibly owned a practice, this is a second practice they're purchasing, for example, if they're a more green dentist than that, it is highly unlikely that you'll be able to step into the same shoes and be able to generate the same turnover.
Yeah, 100%. And it's I appreciate the vendor's position. They've worked so hard in the business, they just want to retire, they just want to sell it and move on. But if they are if all the goodwill and the relationship is in them, and they do want a significant amount of money for it, well, there's got to be some consideration and plan for how to transition that, and how to make sure that the purchaser actually gets some level of value out of the price that they're paying. So, I mean, yeah, you often see that vendors are happy to stay on for a certain period, perhaps on reduced hours or that sort of thing, but you've got to really consider that as a purchaser, that you're getting, it's an investment decision really around that side of things. Yeah.
Is it as simple as saying the purchase price, you might be the buyer may have the opportunity to reduce the purchase price down a little bit if the dentist just wants to shut up themselves and move on straight away? That's groovy. That's fine that you do that, but let's bring that goodwill price down a little bit.
100%. Yeah, 100%. These are all matters for that negotiation, and that's why. That's why we said, sort of reiterating, speak to a lawyer, speak to your accountant first before you go too far down the road of, even if it's just sort of verbal or in principle agreement on key terms, it'll be super hard to move away from that once those discussions have happened. But it sort of can't be viewed in a vacuum, and you can't sort of look at just the price and then, you know, not looking at, okay, well, how are we going to make sure that the business actually capitalizes on the price that's paid? You know, what's the plan there? So it's really got to be looked at all together in that way.
Yeah, and the potential that business could be with that new owner. There may be a lot of space there, and they're like, I'm going to get in there and get a couple of associate dentists in straight away. Could be new dentists buying a singular practitioner practice and wanting to grow it quite quickly and be quite competent in their skill set as well. So you're not just buying what it is, you're buying the potential of what it could be.
That's exactly right. Exactly. So that, you know, then feeds into, look, who is the purchaser, and is it the purchaser's, you know, very first practice, or, you know, as you say, they might be quite junior in their career, or it could be that it's a group of, you know, 2 or 3 sort of established dentists who are coming in, who've got really good reputations themselves, deliver really good service, have experience in converting patient relationships, and that may not be such a concern for them in that scenario, but it is just that consideration that there will be a level of attachment between patient and dentist, no matter who the purchaser is, that there needs to be some consideration for how to transition that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Any other red flags you want to mention?
Look, I think I would just say there's many, but I would say on the financial performance side of things. So really having a good accountant who has experience in working with health practices, look at the financials and interrogate the financials for at least the last sort of 3 financial years. You know, particularly given COVID, is the business actually sustainable and viable without JobKeeper or other government grants and things like that? Once you take those things away, you know, what does it look like? And that's why sometimes the financials from 3-4 years ago may not be as relevant now, because we're in this new world where last year is super important, and then, you know, how is the business going this financial year, even though we've only got sort of 3 months to go on at this point, but those 3 months are really telling for a lot of businesses in terms of how sustainable are they in this new world without any funding really from the government. So I think that's critical, that there's some really good financial due diligence conducted, not just the legal side, the financial side, and that the purchase price then is formulated from that.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there is some evidence over the past few months that client base is being nurtured and maintained there are some practices that are open and still functioning every day in limited capacity, but then there are some that are still closed in lockdown here in Melbourne, for example. And is that practice not contacting the patients at all? And so if they've needed care, they're actually going somewhere else to get that? Or are you maintaining those relationships? You need evidence around that at the moment, don't you?
Exactly, and that's right. I mean, practices have sort of done it very differently, really. You know, I'll hear some client dental practices who, they're not open at all. But then, you know, I had another one the other day where, no, they were contacting clients and saying, no, look, this treatment is urgent. You know, you haven't been to see us for a year or whatever it is. You really need to come in and make sure that it's done. So there are ways that the practice can continue to operate, but practices are definitely all doing it a little bit differently.
It is a new world, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's a temporary one, but the longer time goes on, I think the less hope we have around that.
I know.
Well, thank you so much, Meghan. You have been, again, just a wonderful source of guidance and support.
Pleasure.
And you always have the caveat in there, this is for information only, this is not legal advice.
Yes, it's general advice only, and we've not considered your personal circumstances. Yep. Oh, no.
There are dentists out there that think this is the next step. I want to make sure I get the right advice when I'm buying a practice. What is the best next step in your brain for them?
So I think if it's a situation where there's any queries, or, you know, perhaps you haven't sought professional advice before, or you're not, often the situation is you've had some professional advice, but you're perhaps not satisfied with it or feel that the advisor doesn't have experience in this industry specifically, just reach out to us. So either myself, George, Elizabeth, Christy, we're probably the best to reach out to initially. Telephone is fine, just pick up the phone or pop us an email and say that you want to have an initial chat with us, initial Zoom. We're always more than happy to jump on for 30 minutes, and it's a good way to get to know you and introduce what we do, what you're looking to do, and kind of explore if there's any synergy there. That's really, you can't go wrong with that. So
just pick up that phone or drop that email. I think that's a tremendous first step. That list of things to look for when you are looking for a practice, I think getting that list nice and early, getting those ideas nice and early is a tremendous first step. As always, all the contact details are in the show notes. And thank you so much, Meghan. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me.
Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, you should join the club. The club members receive an online lunch and learn every week where I share insights, systems and strategies to improve the success of your practice. These lunch and learns could not be easier. They are recording so you can watch them at a time that suit you. Members also have full access to the library of all of our past topics. It is a powerful and effective way to upskill your team. I hope to see you there.